Vampire king disguised as a beggar to test his staff. The poorest maid shared her only meal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The storm arrived without warning that night. Heavy rain slammed against the tall iron gates of Ashford Estate, while cold winds swept across the wide marble courtyard like a restless ghost. The ancient mansion stood on a hill outside a quiet American city, its tall windows glowing faintly with golden light. Inside the mansion, hundreds of servants moved quietly through long hallways and grand dining rooms, preparing for another night of work under the watchful eyes of their masters. Most of them believed the estate belonged to a powerful billionaire who rarely appeared in public. Almost none of them knew the truth. The owner of Ashford Estate was not simply a wealthy man. He was Lucian Ashford, the Vampire King, a ruler who had walked the earth for more than 600 years. For centuries, Lucian had observed humanity with growing disappointment, greed, cruelty, indifference. He had seen too much of it to believe that true kindness still existed among ordinary people. That belief was why he had chosen this particular night. While thunder rolled across the dark sky and rain soaked the empty road beyond the gates, a lone figure slowly approached the entrance of the estate. The man looked weak and miserable. His coat was torn. His boots were soaked with mud. Rainwater dripped from tangled gray hair that clung to his pale face. To anyone watching, he appeared to be nothing more than a starving beggar seeking shelter from the storm. The guards at the front gate reacted exactly as expected. One of them stepped forward with clear disgust in his voice and ordered the stranger to leave immediately. Another guard laughed and muttered that the estate was not a place for homeless drifters. The beggar lowered his head and said nothing. Rain continued to pour down his shoulders while the guards argued about whether they should force him away. None of them realized they were standing only a few feet from the most powerful vampire on Earth. Lucian Ashford had hidden his supernatural presence so completely that even the vampires inside the mansion could not sense him. Tonight was not about power. Tonight was about truth. He wanted to see how the people who served his house would treat someone who had nothing. At last the guards grew tired of arguing. One of them pushed the iron gate slightly open and ordered the beggar to move along before they called the police. The stranger nodded slowly and stepped through the gate as if he intended to leave. But instead of walking back toward the dark road, he quietly turned toward the servant quarters beside the mansion. Somewhere in that building, a young maid named Emily Carter was finishing a long shift in the kitchen. She had no idea that within the next few minutes her simple act of kindness would change the fate of the entire Ashford Estate. Inside the servant wing of Ashford Estate, the night moved slowly beneath warm yellow lights and the quiet sound of work that never truly ended. The kitchen was still alive with motion even though the storm outside had already passed midnight. Pots simmered on low heat. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread drifted through the air while cooks and assistants hurried to finish their duties before the next shift began. Among them moved a young woman who seemed almost invisible to everyone around her. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 23 years old and had been working at Ashford Estate for only 4 months. In that short time, she had already learned something important about the mansion. The place looked beautiful from the outside, but for servants, it was a world ruled by strict order and quiet fear. Supervisors watched every movement. Mistakes were remembered. Kindness was rare. Emily kept her head down and worked harder than anyone else because she could not afford to lose the job. Every week, she sent most of her paycheck back to a small town in northern Ohio where her younger brother lived with a neighbor who helped take care of him. The boy was only 12 years old and had been born with a weak heart that made even small physical activity difficult. Hospital visits and medication cost more money than Emily had ever imagined earning in her life. That was why she had traveled nearly 500 miles to take this job at Ashford Estate. It paid more than any restaurant or store near her hometown. But the work demanded everything from her. 16 hours some days. Standing on tired feet across cold marble floors. Carrying heavy trays through endless hallways that seemed to stretch forever beneath tall ceilings and crystal lights. Most of the other maids did not speak much to Emily. Some ignored her completely, while others whispered that she would not last long because the estate always found a reason to replace servants who could not keep up. Tonight had been especially long. The evening banquet for several powerful guests had ended only an hour earlier, and the kitchen still looked like a battlefield of dirty dishes and half-empty serving trays. Emily had spent the last 2 hours scrubbing pans beside a large sink while hot water steamed against the cool air of the room. Her back ached. Her hands were red from soap and heat. But she never complained. Complaining was dangerous in a place where dozens of other people were waiting for a chance to take your job. At last the head cook dismissed the remaining staff, and the kitchen slowly emptied. Emily removed her apron and hung it carefully on a hook beside the door. In her small locker, she found the simple dinner she had saved from earlier in the evening. A small container with a piece of bread and a portion of vegetable stew that had not been served to the guests. It was not much, but after such a long shift it felt like a reward. She wrapped her thin coat around her shoulders and stepped outside into the servant courtyard where the cool night air smelled of rain and wet stone. The storm had already begun to fade, and the clouds above the estate were slowly breaking apart. Emily sat on a narrow wooden bench near the back gate where servants often rested for a few minutes before walking to the small dormitory building across the road. The courtyard was quiet now. Only the distant hum of generators and the soft rustle of trees could be heard. Emily opened the container and held the warm food in her hands for a moment. Her stomach tightened with hunger. She had not eaten since early afternoon. For a few peaceful seconds, she simply breathed in the steam rising from the stew. Then a faint sound reached her ears from the direction of the outer gate. Slow footsteps on wet gravel. Emily lifted her head and looked toward the shadows beyond the courtyard wall. A figure was moving slowly along the fence line. The man walked with difficulty, as if every step required effort. His clothes were soaked and torn. Even from a distance, Emily could see that he was shaking from cold. She watched quietly for a moment, trying to understand why someone would be wandering near the servant entrance of Ashford Estate in the middle of such a night. The guards usually kept the area clear of strangers. But the man continued forward until the dim courtyard lights revealed his face. Pale, exhausted, hungry. And in that instant, Emily Carter made a decision that would soon change far more than her own life. Emily Carter slowly rose from the wooden bench while the faint courtyard light revealed the struggling figure beyond the fence line. For a brief moment she hesitated. Working at Ashford Estate had taught her an important rule very quickly. Do not get involved in anything outside your assigned duties. Servants who broke rules did not remain servants for long. Yet as she watched the man stumble closer through the wet gravel, something inside her chest tightened with concern. The stranger looked exhausted in a way that could not be faked. His shoulders sagged beneath a torn coat that barely protected him from the cold night air. Rainwater still dripped from his sleeves, and his breathing sounded slow and uneven, as if he had walked a long distance with very little strength left. Emily glanced toward the main courtyard entrance where the security guards usually stood watch, but the storm had scattered the staff across the estate, and no one seemed to notice the lone stranger approaching the servant wing. She stepped carefully toward the fence gate and spoke in a quiet voice that carried across the damp air. "Sir, are you all right?" The man stopped walking and slowly lifted his head. In the weak light his face appeared pale and worn by fatigue. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes, and his dark hair hung loose and tangled around his forehead. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied Emily with a calm expression that seemed strangely steady for someone who looked so close to collapse. For an instant, Emily felt an unusual sensation, as if the silence between them carried more weight than the moment required. But the feeling vanished quickly when the man lowered his gaze again and spoke in a hoarse voice. "I apologize for disturbing you. I only needed a moment to rest before continuing down the road." Emily noticed how carefully he chose his words. Even his voice carried a quiet strength that did not match his ragged appearance. She opened the gate a few inches and stepped closer while still keeping a respectful distance. "You look freezing," she said gently. "The storm was rough tonight." The man gave a faint nod, but did not move forward. "I have endured worse weather before," he replied calmly. His answer was simple, yet the tone behind it felt oddly distant, as if the memory of many difficult nights rested behind those words. Emily studied him for another moment, and then glanced down at the small container of food still warming her hands. Her stomach reminded her sharply that she had not eaten all day, but the thought lasted only a second before another image appeared in her mind. Her younger brother sitting at the kitchen table back home, with the same tired look in his eyes whenever money was too tight to buy enough groceries. Emily understood hunger very well. She took a slow breath and held the container toward the stranger through the gate opening. "It is not much," she said softly, "but you should eat something." The man did not immediately reach for the food. Instead, he looked at her again with a level of focus that felt almost piercing. In truth, the stranger before her was not an ordinary traveler at all. Hidden beneath the disguise of torn clothing and cold-soaked fabric stood Lucien Ashford, the Vampire King, who had ruled the night world for more than 600 years. He had walked across continents and watched entire nations rise and fall, while human generations passed like brief sparks in the wind. For centuries, he had believed he understood the nature of human kindness. In his experience, most people were generous only when they expected something in return. Yet here stood a young maid who possessed almost nothing and still offered the only meal she had after a long day of exhausting labor. Lucien felt a quiet curiosity stir deep within him. This was precisely the kind of moment he had come to witness. Slowly he accepted the small container from Emily's hands. "Thank you," he said in a calm voice. "You are very kind." Emily shrugged gently, as if the gesture meant little to her. "Everyone deserves a warm meal on a cold night," she replied. What neither of them realized yet was that this simple act of compassion had already begun to change the course of the test that the Vampire King had planned for the entire estate. Emily Carter watched quietly as the weary stranger held the small container of food in his hands. Steam rose gently into the cool night air, while the courtyard lights cast long shadows across the wet stone ground. For a moment neither of them spoke. The estate around them seemed strangely quiet, as if the storm had washed away the usual sounds of late-night work and distant conversation. Lucien Ashford slowly opened the container and studied the simple meal inside. A piece of bread and a modest portion of vegetable stew. Nothing more. Yet to the young maid standing in front of him, it had clearly been her only dinner after a long, exhausting shift. He lifted the bread and took a small bite while keeping his gaze lowered. The taste meant nothing to a creature who had lived for centuries on blood rather than ordinary food, but the gesture mattered. Across 600 years, Lucien had watched countless humans perform acts of kindness when others were watching. Charity at public events. Generosity that earned praise or reputation. But this moment was different. There were no witnesses, no reward, no advantage to gain. Only a tired young woman offering the last of her food to a stranger who looked like he had nothing to give in return. Emily leaned back against the wooden bench and wrapped her thin coat more tightly around her shoulders as the night breeze moved through the courtyard. She did not stare at the man while he ate. Instead, she looked up at the dark sky where the storm clouds were slowly drifting apart to reveal a few faint stars above the estate. "My brother loves nights like this," she said quietly. After a moment, when the rain clears and the sky opens again, the stranger raised his eyes slightly. "You have family nearby?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "No, they are back in Ohio. My little brother lives there with a neighbor who helps take care of him." She paused briefly before continuing in a calm voice. "His heart is weak, so I send most of my paycheck home for his medicine and doctor visits. That is why I work here." Lucien listened carefully without interrupting. Human lives were usually brief and fragile, yet they were filled with stories like this one. Struggles carried quietly without praise or recognition. Emily gave a small shrug and smiled faintly, as if she did not want the conversation to feel heavy. "It is not so bad though," she added. "At least this job keeps him safe." The stranger finished another small bite of bread and closed the container slowly. "You gave up your only meal for someone you have never met," he said in a thoughtful tone. "That is unusual." Emily gave a soft laugh. "I have skipped meals before," she replied. "Missing one more will not hurt me. But you look like you needed it more than I did." Her words settled into the quiet air between them. For the first time that night, Lucien Ashford felt something unexpected stir beneath the cold discipline of his ancient mind. Curiosity was one thing. Respect was another. The test he had planned for the servants of Ashford Estate was simple. He would move through the grounds disguised as a helpless beggar and observe how those who served his house treated someone who appeared powerless. Already he had seen enough cruelty and indifference from others at the gate to confirm his old suspicions about human nature. Yet here in the quiet servant courtyard one young maid had already changed the pattern of the night. Before Lucien could speak again, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor leading back into the estate. The heavy door opened with a sharp creak and a tall man in a dark supervisor uniform stepped into the courtyard carrying a lantern. His sharp eyes moved quickly across the scene until they landed on Emily and the ragged stranger beside the gate. His expression hardened immediately. "Emily Carter," he said with cold authority. "What exactly do you think you are doing out here with that man?" The courtyard fell silent the moment the supervisor stepped closer into the lantern light. His name was Harold Whitaker, and every servant inside Ashford Estate knew his reputation well. Whitaker was a man who believed discipline was the only language servants should understand. His tall frame and stiff uniform gave him the appearance of a soldier rather than a household manager, and his narrow eyes rarely showed patience for anything that disrupted the perfect order of the estate. The lantern in his hand cast a harsh glow across the wet ground as he approached Emily and the ragged stranger standing near the gate. Emily straightened quickly and lowered her head out of habit. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker," she said respectfully. "I was just finishing my shift." Whitaker barely acknowledged the greeting. His attention was fixed on the man beside the gate. The expression on his face twisted with immediate disgust. "Who is this man?" he demanded sharply. "And why is he inside the servant courtyard?" Emily hesitated only briefly before answering. "He looked cold and hungry, sir. I gave him some food before he continued down the road." Whitaker stared at her as if she had just confessed to a serious crime. "You allowed a stranger onto private property," he said slowly. His voice was calm, but every servant in the estate knew that calm tone meant trouble was coming. Emily felt her stomach tighten. The stranger remained quiet beside her. Lucien Ashford stood perfectly still beneath the torn coat of his disguise, while observing the exchange with careful interest. In his 600 years of existence, he had learned that power often revealed itself most clearly in moments like this. Not in grand halls or battlefields, but in small encounters where authority met compassion. Whitaker stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away from Emily. His lantern lifted higher, so the light revealed every detail of the scene. The open container of food, the thin coat wrapped around the young maid, the weary stranger whose presence clearly irritated him. "This estate feeds its servants and its guests," he said coldly. "It does not feed vagrants who wander in from the road." Emily swallowed quietly, but did not step back. "He looked like he needed help," she answered softly. Whitaker let out a short, humorless laugh. "That is not your concern, Miss Carter. Your concern is following the rules of this house." He turned his sharp gaze toward the stranger. "And you," he added with open contempt. "Whatever you hope to gain from this little performance, you should leave before the guards escort you off the property." Lucien slowly lifted his head and met the supervisor gaze. For a brief instant something passed between them that Whitaker could not explain. The beggar eyes seemed far too calm for a man in such miserable condition. But the moment faded as quickly as it appeared, and Lucien lowered his gaze again, as if accepting the insult without protest. "I meant no trouble," he said quietly. "I will leave immediately." Whitaker nodded with satisfaction. "See that you do." Then his attention returned to Emily. "You will report to the service office first thing in the morning," he said firmly. "We will discuss your decision to break estate protocol by inviting strangers inside the grounds." Emily felt a small wave of fear, but forced herself to remain composed. "Yes, sir," she replied. Whitaker turned and walked back toward the corridor door without another word. The lantern light faded with his departure, leaving the courtyard dim once again. Emily exhaled slowly after the heavy door closed behind him. She looked toward the stranger with an apologetic smile. "I am sorry about that," she said quietly. "Mr. Whitaker takes his job very seriously." Lucien studied her face for a moment. Despite the clear risk to her own position, she showed no regret for what she had done. The young maid had offered kindness when no one else would, and now she was prepared to face consequences for it. The ancient vampire king felt the faintest shift of something unfamiliar within his thoughts. His test had only just begun, but already the night was unfolding in ways he had not expected. The courtyard remained quiet for several long seconds after the heavy door closed behind Harold Whitaker. The faint sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor until only the distant hum of the estate generators and the whisper of wind across wet stone remained. Emily Carter stood beside the gate with her hands folded in front of her coat, as if she was still gathering her thoughts. The brief confrontation had left a tension in the air, but she did not appear angry or frightened. Instead, she simply looked a little tired, as if the night had grown longer than she expected. The stranger beside her remained motionless for a moment longer. Lucian Ashford studied the young maid with a calm expression that revealed none of the complex thoughts moving through his ancient mind. For centuries, he had observed the behavior of humans in situations of power and weakness. Most kindness faded the moment authority appeared in the room. Yet Emily Carter had not taken back her gesture even when the supervisor made it clear she might lose her position because of it. That detail mattered more than the food itself. Lucian finally spoke in a quiet voice that carried easily through the still night air. "You should not have done that," he said gently. Emily turned her head toward him with a small look of confusion. "Done what?" she asked. "Given me your dinner," he replied. "Your supervisor seemed very clear about the rules of this place." Emily let out a soft breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Mr. Whitaker believes rules are the most important thing in the world," she said. "But sometimes people matter more than rules." Lucian watched her carefully. "And what will happen tomorrow when he questions you about this?" she continued. Emily looked down at the damp ground for a moment before answering. "I will tell him the truth," she said calmly. "I helped someone who looked hungry. If that costs me my job, then I will find another one somewhere else." Her words carried a quiet certainty that surprised even Lucian. Most people in difficult situations tried to justify their actions with excuses or blame. Emily simply accepted the possible consequences without resentment. The ancient vampire king felt the faint echo of a forgotten emotion stir somewhere deep within him. It was not admiration exactly, but it was close enough to make him pause. The night air moved gently through the courtyard, and Lucian sensed something else beneath the quiet surface of the estate. Inside the mansion, dozens of vampires moved through the halls, performing their duties as guards, advisors, and attendants. None of them realized their king was standing only a short distance away, disguised as a beggar in the servant yard. Yet their instincts were beginning to stir. A few of them felt a strange disturbance they could not explain. It was the faint shadow of Lucian's presence, leaking through the disguise he wore. Emily did not notice anything unusual. She stepped toward the gate and opened it wider so the stranger could leave the courtyard without climbing over the fence. The road outside looked dark and empty beneath the slowly clearing sky. "You should probably go before someone else comes looking," she said kindly. "The guards on the front gate will not be as patient as Mr. Whitaker." Lucian looked out toward the quiet road for a moment, but he did not move immediately. His plan for the night had been simple. Walk the grounds in disguise. Observe the servants. Learn which of them treated the weak with cruelty and which of them offered compassion. Yet the test was already changing in a way he had not expected. Emily Carter had shown him something rare in the first hour of his experiment, a kindness that asked for nothing in return. He turned back toward her with a thoughtful gaze. "Tell me something," he said slowly. "Why did you choose to help a stranger tonight when everyone else chose to turn away?" Emily did not answer right away. She thought about the question carefully before finally speaking in a quiet voice. "Because someone once helped my family when we had nothing," she said. "And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance I would do the same for someone else." Lucian Ashford remained silent after hearing those words. The storm clouds above the estate drifted apart, revealing more stars in the dark sky. For the first time in many years, the ancient king wondered if his long-held beliefs about human nature might not be as complete as he once believed. Emily Carter stood quietly beside the open gate, while the night air carried the faint scent of rain across the courtyard. Her answer lingered between them like a fragile truth that could easily disappear if either of them spoke too quickly. Lucian Ashford remained silent for several long seconds as he studied the young maid with careful attention. For more than 600 years, he had watched human societies change. Cities grew where forests once stood. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves against the shore of time. Through all those centuries, he had learned one lesson that seemed unshakable. Most people protected themselves first. Kindness was rare and usually temporary. Yet the woman standing before him did not look like someone who had calculated her choice. She had acted without hesitation even when it placed her own future at risk. The ancient vampire king felt the faintest shift in the quiet order of his thoughts. It was a subtle thing. A small crack in a belief that had hardened over many lifetimes. Emily finally broke the silence with a gentle nod toward the road outside the gate. You should probably get going now, she said kindly. If Mr. Whitaker comes back and finds you still here, he will not be happy. Lucien looked toward the dark road, but did not move immediately. The gravel path stretched through tall trees toward the distant highway where an occasional truck passed in the far distance. The night had grown calmer now that the storm had moved on. A few stars glimmered above the estate walls like quiet witnesses to the moment unfolding in the servant yard. Lucien turned his gaze back to Emily. There was something about the way she stood that caught his attention. Her coat was thin and her shoes were worn from long hours on hard floors, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity that did not depend on wealth or status. Few people possessed that quality. He decided to ask one more question before leaving. If you lose your position here tomorrow, he said slowly, what will you do? Emily gave a thoughtful shrug. I will look for work somewhere else, she answered. There are always places that need people who are willing to work hard. She hesitated briefly before continuing. My brother still needs his medicine, so I cannot give up even if things get difficult. Lucien nodded once. The determination in her voice sounded familiar to him in a distant way. Long ago he had known humans who spoke with the same quiet resolve when protecting those they loved. He stepped toward the open gate and paused beside her. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to study her more closely. Her eyes showed exhaustion, but also warmth that had not been erased by hardship. Emily noticed his gaze and looked slightly embarrassed. Is something wrong, she asked. Lucien shook his head. No, he replied softly. I was simply thinking that the world is fortunate to have people like you in it. Emily smiled faintly, as if unsure how to respond to such words. I do not know about that, she said. I just try to do what feels right. Lucien stepped through the gate and onto the gravel road outside the estate. For a moment he stood there looking back at the quiet courtyard where the young maid still waited beside the fence. The test he had planned for the night had already revealed more than he expected. Among hundreds of servants inside the estate, one person had shown genuine compassion without knowing who he truly was. That discovery carried more weight than he cared to admit. Emily lifted her hand in a small wave. Stay safe on the road, she called gently. Lucien inclined his head in acknowledgement and turned to walk down the dark path. Yet after only a few steps he stopped again as another thought entered his mind. The test was not finished yet. In truth, it had only just begun. He continued walking into the shadows while the lights of Ashford Estate glowed behind him like a silent fortress on the hill. Inside those walls, dozens of servants believed the night had ended like any other. None of them knew that their king was about to decide which of them truly deserved to remain under his protection and which of them would soon face consequences for the cruelty they had shown a helpless stranger. Emily Carter remained beside the gate for a few seconds after the stranger disappeared into the darkness of the road. The gravel path beyond the estate grew quiet again as the faint sound of his footsteps faded into the trees. She finally closed the gate slowly and rested her hands on the cold metal bars while looking toward the distant lights of the highway. Something about the encounter lingered in her thoughts. The man had spoken calmly and carried himself with a strange sense of dignity that did not match the appearance of a homeless traveler. Yet she pushed the thought aside. Ashford Estate was full of unusual moments and questions that servants quickly learned not to explore too deeply. Emily took a slow breath and turned back toward the servant courtyard. The warmth of the kitchen building called to her tired body, and she knew she still had a long walk ahead to the dormitory where the staff slept. But before she could take more than 2 steps, the heavy corridor door opened again with a sharp sound that echoed across the quiet yard. Harold Whitaker stepped outside once more. This time his expression was far colder than before. In his hand he carried a small notebook and a lantern whose bright light swept across the courtyard until it stopped on Emily. I thought I told you to return inside immediately after finishing your shift, he said sternly. Emily straightened instinctively. I was just about to leave, sir, she replied. Whitaker walked toward her slowly while glancing at the open gate and the empty road beyond. His eyes narrowed as if he was still searching for the stranger who had been standing there moments earlier. He is gone then, he said. Yes, sir, Emily answered. Whitaker made a short sound of irritation under his breath. You should consider yourself fortunate that he left quickly, he continued. Allowing strangers onto the estate grounds creates unnecessary risks for everyone who works here. Emily nodded politely, but said nothing. Whitaker closed his notebook with a sharp motion. Your actions tonight show poor judgment, Miss Carter, he said. Tomorrow morning you will report to the service office at 8 o'clock sharp. The house manager will decide whether your behavior deserves disciplinary action. Emily felt the weight of those words settle heavily in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. Yes, sir, she replied. Whitaker studied her face as if expecting fear or protest, yet Emily simply accepted the instruction without argument. The supervisor shook his head slightly before turning back toward the corridor. I suggest you spend the night thinking carefully about your priorities, he added. This estate rewards loyalty to its rules, not misplaced charity. The door closed behind him again, leaving the courtyard silent for the second time that night. Emily remained standing for a moment while the reality of the situation settled into her thoughts. Losing this job would mean searching for work all over again, and every week without income would make it harder to send money home for her brother's medical care. She looked toward the gate once more where the stranger had stood earlier. For a brief moment doubt crept into her mind. Had she made a mistake by helping him? The question lingered only a second before she shook her head gently. No, she whispered to herself. A hungry man deserved a meal whether the rules allowed it or not. With that quiet certainty, she walked across the courtyard toward the dormitory path beneath the soft glow of the estate lights. High above the estate walls the night sky had cleared completely, and the stars shone brightly over the silent hill. Far down the road beyond the trees a lone figure had stopped walking and turned back toward Ashford Estate. Lucian Ashford stood in the shadows watching the distant courtyard with calm interest. From this distance the servants could not see him, but his supernatural senses allowed him to observe every movement around the property. He had heard Whitaker's voice clearly, and every word spoken to the young maid. The ancient vampire king folded his arms slowly as a new idea formed in his mind. The test he had planned for his staff was about to grow far more serious than any of them expected. And by the time the sun rose over the estate, the fate of several people inside those walls would begin to change forever. Morning arrived slowly over Ashford Estate as pale sunlight spread across the wide grounds, and the tall windows of the mansion reflected the soft glow of the rising sun. The storm from the previous night had washed the air clean, and the estate looked calm and orderly, as if nothing unusual had happened. Servants moved through the hallways with quiet discipline, while kitchen staff prepared breakfast for the early rising guests. Yet beneath the routine of another working day, a quiet tension waited to unfold. Emily Carter walked through the servant corridor with careful steps, while holding her small notebook of daily tasks. She had slept very little during the night. Thoughts about the meeting with the service office repeated again and again in her mind. If the managers decided to dismiss her, there would be no argument she could make to change their decision. Jobs like this were not easy to find, and Ashford Estate had a long list of people willing to replace anyone who caused trouble. Still, she reminded herself that regret would not change what had already happened. She had helped someone who looked hungry and alone, and she would accept whatever consequences followed. As she reached the end of the corridor, two other maids were already standing outside the service office door, whispering quietly. They both glanced at Emily the moment she approached. One of them lowered her voice. We heard Whitaker reported you to the house manager last night, she said. Emily nodded calmly. Yes, he did. The second maid looked uneasy. People usually lose their positions after something like that, she murmured. Emily gave a small polite smile, but did not respond. At that moment the office door opened and Harold Whitaker stepped into the hallway holding a clipboard. His eyes moved directly to Emily. Miss Carter, he said sharply. Come inside. Emily stepped forward while the other servants watched in silence. Inside the office, the house manager sat behind a large desk reviewing several documents. His name was Thomas Bennett, and he was responsible for the daily operation of every servant and worker on the estate. Bennett looked up as Emily entered and studied her quietly for a moment before speaking. Mr. Whitaker informed me about your actions last night, he said. According to his report, you allowed a stranger onto estate property and gave him food from the kitchen supply. Emily stood with her hands folded in front of her coat and answered honestly. Yes, sir, that is correct. Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair. And you understand that such behavior violates the rules of this house, he continued. Emily nodded. Yes, sir, I understand. Whitaker stood beside the desk with a satisfied expression as if the outcome of this meeting had already been decided. Bennett opened a folder and prepared to speak again, but at that exact moment a sudden commotion echoed from the hallway outside the office. Footsteps hurried across the marble floor, and voices murmured in surprise. Whitaker frowned and moved toward the door. "What is happening out there?" he demanded. Before anyone could answer, the corridor fell silent in an instant. The quiet that followed felt heavy and unusual, as if the entire floor of the estate had stopped breathing at the same time. Then a calm, powerful voice spoke from just beyond the doorway. "That will not be necessary, Mr. Whitaker." The words carried a tone of authority so absolute that both Whitaker and Bennett froze where they stood. Emily turned her head slowly toward the entrance as the office door opened. Standing in the corridor was a tall man dressed in a dark tailored coat, whose presence seemed to command the entire space without effort. Several senior staff members stood behind him with lowered heads. The moment Harold Whitaker recognized the man, his face drained of color. "Your Majesty," he whispered in disbelief. Lucian Ashford, the true master of the estate, had just arrived. The corridor outside the service office seemed to shrink the moment Lucian Ashford stepped into view. Servants who had been walking through the hallway only seconds earlier now stood frozen along the walls with their heads lowered in silence. Even the air itself felt heavier, as if the presence of the estate master carried a weight that demanded immediate respect. Emily Carter remained standing inside the office doorway, unable to fully understand what she was seeing. The man standing in the corridor was dressed in a dark coat tailored with quiet elegance, and his posture carried the calm confidence of someone who had never doubted his authority. His eyes moved across the room, slowly taking in every detail. When his gaze passed over Harold Whitaker, the supervisor instinctively lowered his head. "Your Majesty," Whitaker said again with a voice that trembled slightly. "We did not expect your return this morning." Lucian Ashford stepped forward with measured calm until he stood inside the doorway of the office. His presence filled the small room without effort. "That much is obvious, Mr. Whitaker," he replied quietly. The tone of his voice was soft, yet the authority within it was impossible to ignore. House Manager Thomas Bennett quickly stood from behind the desk. "Your Majesty, we were only addressing a minor disciplinary matter involving one of the servants," he explained carefully. Lucian turned his attention toward Bennett for a brief moment before his eyes moved to Emily Carter. For the first time since the corridor fell silent, Emily felt the full focus of his gaze. A strange sense of recognition flickered across her thoughts, but she could not understand why. The man standing before her looked nothing like the weary stranger she had spoken to the night before. His dark coat was clean and perfectly fitted, and his expression carried the quiet strength of someone accustomed to command. Yet something about the calm steadiness of his eyes felt familiar. Lucian watched her reaction without speaking. The room remained silent as every servant and manager waited for him to continue. Finally, he turned his gaze back to Whitaker. "I understand that Miss Carter is being disciplined for assisting a stranger last night," he said. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. She allowed an unknown man onto estate property and provided him with food from the kitchen supply. Such behavior violates estate protocol." Lucian took a slow step forward and rested one hand lightly against the edge of the desk. "And this stranger she assisted," he said calmly. "What harm did he cause to this estate?" Whitaker hesitated before answering. "None, Your Majesty." The man left shortly after the incident. Lucian nodded once. "I see." Then he turned again toward Emily. "Tell me, Miss Carter," he said gently. "When you offered food to that stranger, did you know who he was?" Emily felt every eye in the room watching her, but she answered honestly. "No, sir, I did not. He looked cold and hungry, so I shared my meal with him." Lucian studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing the truth behind her words. Finally, he spoke again. "That was a generous choice," he said quietly. Whitaker shifted his stance uneasily. "Your Majesty, the issue is not generosity," he insisted. "The issue is obedience to the rules that protect this estate." Lucian slowly turned his head toward the supervisor, and for the first time a faint edge entered his calm expression. "Mr. Whitaker," he said softly, "last night you encountered that same stranger in the courtyard, did you not?" Whitaker nodded cautiously. "Yes, Your Majesty." "And how did you treat him?" Lucian asked. Whitaker looked uncertain now. "I ordered him to leave the property," he replied, "because he appeared to be a vagrant." Lucian straightened and looked around the office at the silent witnesses gathered in the doorway. Then he spoke words that sent a ripple of shock through everyone present. "That vagrant," he said slowly, "was me." The words fell into the room like a sudden storm. For a long moment no one moved. Harold Whitaker stood frozen beside the desk with his mouth slightly open as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. Thomas Bennet slowly lowered the document in his hand while the servants gathered in the hallway stared in stunned silence. Emily Carter felt the world around her shift in a way she could barely comprehend. The stranger from the previous night. The tired man in the torn coat who had accepted her simple meal with quiet gratitude. He was standing in front of her now dressed in dark authority as the master of the entire estate. Lucian Ashford watched their reactions calmly. His expression remained composed, but the quiet power in his presence filled every corner of the office. Yes, he continued in the same steady voice. Last night, I walked the grounds of my own estate disguised as a beggar. I wish to see how those who serve this house treat someone who appears to have nothing. The silence deepened as his words settled over the room. Whitaker slowly found his voice, but it sounded weak and uncertain. Your Majesty, I did not realize he began. Lucian raised one hand slightly, and the supervisor stopped speaking at once. That is precisely the point, Mr. Whitaker, Lucian said. You did not realize who I was. Therefore your actions revealed how you treat those who hold no power in your eyes. Whitaker lowered his head quickly. I only intended to protect the estate, he said. Lucian studied him for a moment. Protection and cruelty are not the same thing, he replied quietly. When you saw a man who appeared hungry and cold, you chose contempt instead of compassion. The ancient king then turned his attention toward Thomas Bennet. And you, Mr. Bennet, were prepared to dismiss this young woman for showing kindness where others showed none. Bennet shifted uncomfortably but did not deny the statement. Your Majesty, the rules of the estate exist to maintain order, he answered carefully. Lucian nodded once. Rules are necessary, he said. But rules without humanity become empty commands. He turned slowly and faced Emily Carter again. She still stood near the doorway with her hands folded nervously in front of her coat. Her mind struggled to reconcile the calm ruler before her with the quiet traveler she had spoken to beside the gate. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Miss Carter, he said gently, when you offered that meal last night, you believed I was nothing more than a stranger wandering in the storm. Emily nodded softly. Yes, sir. Lucian continued. And even after Mr. Whitaker warned that your action might cost you this position, you did not regret helping me. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. I only did what felt right, she said. Lucian allowed a faint expression of approval to cross his face. In 600 years of watching the world change, he had seen empires collapse because their leaders forgot a simple truth. Strength without compassion eventually destroys itself. He turned toward the others gathered in the hallway and spoke with quiet authority. Let it be known that Miss Emily Carter will not face punishment for her actions last night. Instead, she has demonstrated the very quality I expect from those who serve within these walls. The servants exchanged stunned glances while Whitaker remained silent beside the desk. Lucian Ashford then looked once more at the young maid who had unknowingly changed the course of his test. And from this day forward, he said calmly, her future within Ashford Estate will not be decided by fear of rules, but by the character she has already shown. The office remained silent long after Lucian Ashford finished speaking. Servants in the hallway stood motionless while the meaning of his words slowly settled across the room. Emily Carter felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Only the night before she had spoken to this man beside a gate in the rain, believing him to be nothing more than a traveler who needed help. Now she stood in the presence of the ruler of the entire estate, and every person around her was waiting for his next decision. Lucian watched the expressions on the faces gathered in the doorway. Fear, confusion, embarrassment. He had seen the same reactions many times across the centuries whenever authority revealed itself without warning. Yet his attention returned quickly to Emily. She was the only one who did not appear afraid of him. Surprised, yes. Overwhelmed, certainly. But not afraid. That detail interested him more than the silence filling the office. Thomas Bennet finally cleared his throat carefully. Your Majesty, he said with cautious respect. What would you like us to do regarding the incident from last night? Lucian turned slightly toward him. The answer is simple, he replied calmly. Miss Carter will continue her work here without penalty. However, this situation has revealed a larger problem within the structure of this estate. Bennet nodded slowly. You believe the staff have forgotten the importance of compassion, he said. Lucian gave a faint nod. Precisely. An estate that values obedience but forgets humanity becomes nothing more than a machine. And machines eventually break. The servants in the hallway lowered their heads further as the meaning of those words settled among them. Lucian stepped away from the desk and walked toward the doorway until he stood only a few feet from Emily. She instinctively straightened her posture, but she did not step back. Up close, the presence of the estate master felt almost unreal. His calm expression carried the weight of centuries, and yet his eyes still held the same quiet steadiness she remembered from the night before. "Tell me something, Miss Carter," he said gently. Emily nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. When you offered that meal last night, did you expect anything in return?" Emily shook her head. "No, sir. I just thought he needed help." Lucian studied her face with quiet attention. "Most people would have worried about the consequences," he said. "Especially after Mr. Whitaker warned you about the rules." Emily thought for a moment before answering. "My brother once told me something when he was very young," she said quietly. "He said that if kindness only exists when it is safe, then it is not really kindness at all." A faint silence followed those words. Even the servants in the hallway seemed to hold their breath. Lucian Ashford felt the echo of that simple truth resonate deeper than he expected. Across 600 years he had ruled cities, armies, and hidden societies, yet moments like this remained rare. A single human voice reminding him why compassion mattered at all. Finally he spoke again. "Your brother sounds wise," he said. Emily gave a small smile. "He just believes the world should be better than it sometimes is." Lucian turned his gaze toward the corridor where the other servants still stood watching. "Let this be understood by everyone here," he said calmly. "The strength of Ashford Estate will not be measured only by discipline and obedience. It will also be measured by the humanity shown to those who appear powerless." He paused briefly before adding another statement that caused quiet surprise among the staff. "Miss Carter's kindness last night has revealed more about this house than any report or inspection ever could." The young maid lowered her eyes, slightly unsure how to respond to such attention. Lucian then looked back toward Thomas Bennet. "Arrange new training for the staff," he instructed. "Every person who serves within these walls must understand that respect for others is not optional." Bennet nodded immediately. "Yes, Your Majesty." The meeting in the office slowly began to dissolve as servants returned to their duties, but the moment remained etched in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For Emily Carter, however, the most unexpected part was still to come. Because as Lucian Ashford turned to leave the room, he paused beside her once more and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear the next words. Lucian Ashford paused beside Emily Carter before leaving the office and spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear him. "Last night you believed you were helping a stranger," he said quietly. "But what you truly did was remind me of something I had nearly forgotten." Emily looked up at him with uncertainty still visible in her eyes. "I only shared a meal," she answered softly. Lucian gave a faint, thoughtful nod. "Sometimes the smallest act reveals the greatest truth," he replied. With that he stepped into the hallway, and the servants immediately lowered their heads as he passed. The corridor slowly returned to motion as staff members hurried back to their duties, but the atmosphere inside the estate had already changed. Word traveled quickly through Ashford Estate that the king himself had walked the grounds in disguise and witnessed the behavior of those who served under his authority. Some servants felt shame remembering how they had ignored the ragged stranger at the gates. Others quietly reflected on the simple courage shown by the young maid who had helped him without hesitation. In the days that followed, Lucian Ashford kept his promise to bring change to the estate. Thomas Bennet organized new training for every supervisor and servant, emphasizing that discipline would never replace humanity within the walls of the house. Harold Whitaker remained in his position, but his authority was reduced, and his responsibilities were carefully supervised. The lesson he learned that morning remained with him long after the shock of the moment faded. Emily Carter returned to her work in the kitchens, expecting life to continue as it always had, but the following week brought a surprise she never imagined. Thomas Bennet called her to the service office, once again, though this time his tone carried respect rather than concern. "Miss Carter," he said, "your actions during the King's test demonstrated qualities that this estate values deeply. His Majesty has requested that you move to a new position assisting the guest services department, where you will help oversee the care of visitors and staff alike." Emily blinked in disbelief. "I have never supervised anyone before," she admitted quietly. Bennet offered a small smile. "That is exactly why you were chosen," he replied. "You understand people before you think about rules." The new role provided better hours and a salary that allowed Emily to send even more support home to Ohio. Within a few months, her brother was able to receive improved medical care, and the letters he sent to her became filled with excitement about the future he once feared he would never have. Yet the greatest change came during a quiet evening several weeks later. Emily was walking through the courtyard after finishing her duties when she noticed Lucian Ashford standing near the same gate where they had first spoken during the storm. This time there was no disguise and no confusion about who he was. She approached carefully and offered a respectful greeting. Lucian turned toward her with the calm expression she remembered. "It seems the estate has adjusted well to its new lessons," he said. Emily nodded gently. "People talk more about helping each other now," she replied. Lucian looked toward the open road beyond the gate where the storm had once passed. "Kindness spreads faster than fear when someone is brave enough to show it first," he said. Emily smiled slightly. "I guess sometimes all it takes is sharing a meal." The ancient king regarded her with quiet approval before turning back toward the mansion. For the first time in many years, Lucian Ashford felt certain that the future of his estate would not be guided only by power, but also by the simple humanity of those who served within its walls. And it had all begun with a young maid who believed that even a stranger in the rain deserved kindness.